Throughout history, there have been many different movements that have changed the world as we've known it. These protests vary in purpose and tactics, but the overall message stays the same. The people involved wanted change, and they're sick of being treated unfairly. A large majority might instantly think of the American Civil Rights Movement or the struggle for women's rights, but a movement that could be overlooked is that of the United Farm Workers and their struggle for the rights of immigrant farmers across the country. Throughout the early 20th century, working conditions for immigrant farm workers were treacherous and unsanitary. Many workers were exposed to hazardous chemicals, inadequate food and shelter, and sexual harassment. In an attempt to counter these major acts of discrimination, two organizations, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee and the National Farm Workers Association, decided to come together in order to fight for a common cause. These groups formed what we now know as the United Farm Workers, with the main goal of organizing migrant farm workers to improve their wages, education, housing, and legal protection. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta were the organizers of this labor union and eventually became the face and voice behind the movement. Through promoting nonviolent methods of protest, the movement began to gain national attention and support that would galvanize the Chicano movement as a whole and allow for serious change to occur. Two of the most influential people involved with the movement have to be Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Both did so much in order to secure the rights that migrant farm workers rightfully deserved. Dolores Huerta is credited with negotiating thousands of labor contracts providing farm workers with improved wages and working conditions, while Cesar Chavez is most known for leading protests that heavily relied upon nonviolence. We will go into more depth for each of these key individuals, but we will first start with Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was born on March 31st, 1927, with both parents being farm workers from Arizona. However, during the Great Depression, Cesar's parents lost their farm and were forced to move to California, where they became migrant workers. During this time, Cesar lived in migrant camps and attended school sporadically, before eventually being drafted into the U.S. Navy during the Second World War. He would go on to serve for 2 years before returning to California and Arizona to help with the farm work. In 1952, Cesar joined the Community Services Organization, where he got his original training as an organizer. After 6 years, he managed to climb the ladder and become the general director of the CSO, but ended up resigning 4 years later to co-found the National Farm Workers Association alongside Dolores Huerta. The success of the NFWA accumulated into a merger with the American Federation of Labor to create the United Farm Workers in 1966. Throughout the rest of his life, Cesar Chavez was able to lead many strikes and protests for the betterment of his people and migrant farm workers across the country. And while his death in 1993 was devastating, his nonviolent activism in support of working people was recognized in 1994 when Chavez was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously. Born on April 30th, 1930, Dolores Huerta was raised by her mother, who was a farm worker in Dawson, New Mexico. After her parents divorced when Dolores was only 3 years old, her mother and her siblings moved to Stockton in California. Dolores' mother and the discrimination around her were the major influences during her early life and is what shaped her towards activism. After receiving an associate teaching degree from the University of Pacific's Delta College, she went through 2 marriages which neither lasted long. As a school teacher, Dolores was troubled by the magnitude of hungry farm children that came into the school daily and wanted to enact some sort of change. So in 1955, Dolores began her activism career by co-founding a Stockton branch for the Community Service Organization, which led voter registration drives and fought for economic improvements for Hispanics. Through a mutual connection with the CSO, Dolores met Cesar Chavez, whom she shared an interest in organizing farm workers. After the United Farm Workers was set in motion, she served as vice president for nearly 28 years total. Throughout the later half of the 20th century, Huerta worked tirelessly to improve workers' legislative representation and to elect more Latinos and women to political office. Overall, she has been a major force throughout the period and has fought for the rights of workers and championed women's issues. Probably the most famous of all the boycotts carried out by the National Farm Workers Union, the grape boycott was a way for migrant farm workers to fight back against the years of low wages and poor working conditions they had faced. On September 8, 1965, Cesar Chavez and the National Farm Workers Association joined many Filipino-American grape workers walking out on strike against Delano area table and wine grape growers. As the strike grew, it began to gain unprecedented support from outside the Central Valley from other unions, church activists, students, Latinos, and other minorities. Cesar Chavez took this opportunity to lead a 300-mile march from Delano to Sacramento, which managed to place their plight directly before the consciousness of the American people. Cesar knew that the greatest weapon that the strikers could utilize was their willingness to persevere no matter what the odds or how long it would take them. Other members of the movement didn't share this philosophy, however, and many younger members wanted to strike back against those who had abused them and prove that they were real men. But Caesar wanted to follow in the footsteps of two of his heroes, Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and to him, peaceful protest was the only way that this movement would end in triumph. As a way of apologizing for the actions of certain members amongst the movement, Caesar decided to fast for 25 days in penance. Caesar believed that as the lead organizer behind the movement, it was his duty to take responsibility for their actions. After the 25 days were up, Cesar Chavez was too weak to speak at all, so his speech was read for him. This passage was all about the importance of nonviolence and self-sacrifice. He states that while violence would get the movement nowhere, peaceful resistance would surely succeed. His speech ended with the solemn words that were meant to inspire more nonviolent action. In this he said, "It is my deepest belief that only by giving our lives do we find life. The truest act of courage, the strongest act of manliness, is to sacrifice ourselves for others in a totally non-violent struggle for justice. To be a man is to suffer for others. God help us to be men." By 1970, the grape boycott was a complete success. Table grape growers at long last signed their first union contracts, granting workers better pay, benefits, and protections. This proved to the impatient that peaceful protests could work. Overall, the United Farm Workers were very successful with the goals that they had set for themselves. In 1975, UFW won the passage of the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, a landmark agreement recognizing the right of farm workers in California to organize. Since those early decades, the UFW has continued to win important victories for farm workers and agricultural industries across the U.S. Other victories that the UFW achieved includes the first contracts to provide rest periods, drinking water, toilets, and hand-washing facilities in the fields, the banning of pesticide spraying while workers were in the field, the protective clothing to help against exposure to pesticides, guaranteed senior and job security, contracts that included profit sharing and parental leave, the first comprehensive union health benefits for farm workers and their families, the first pension plan for retired farm workers, and a farm worker credit union. As you probably noticed, all of the things mentioned above seem like the anticipated benefits that most workers should receive. But before the efforts of the UFW, migrant workers were expected to work for almost nothing while trying to provide for their families. Today, it is estimated that the organization has around 50,000 members, but internal union strife, short-term labor contracts, and lack of federal legislation in regards to farm worker rights have taken a toll on the union. Although the UFW peaked in the 1970s, the organization has continued to fight for problems today, including legislative and regulatory reforms for farm workers covering issues such as worker protections, pesticides, and immigration reform. But just as Cesar Chavez believed before, the United Farm Workers are utilizing their strongest weapon of perseverance in order to maintain the support that they have supplied for decades.